The story begins inside a mansion so large it seemed to swallow the echo of every word. There lived Valentina, a 24-year-old young woman, the only daughter of a real estate magnate. Since childhood, she had learned to look down on the world, as if everyone else were mere pieces in a game, where only the rich made the rules. Her father, Don Arturo Mendez, was a businessman who believed that money healed every wound, except the ones of the soul. Since the death of his wife, when Valentina was still a baby, he had replaced affection with objects, hugs with checks, and love with silence. Valentina grew up surrounded by maids, tutors, and private parties, but without a single warm memory. Everything in her life was glitter and emptiness. Security cameras replaced trust, jewels replaced affection, and trips abroad filled the space where a heart should have been. She was elegant, beautiful, and feared by those who served her, but profoundly unhappy. She didn't know how to listen, much less how to be grateful. In her world, anyone without power didn't deserve respect. One ordinary morning, Don Arturo hired a new housemaid. Her name was Elena Vargas, a woman with a tired face, sun-marked brown skin, and eyes that carried both wisdom and nostalgia. She walked with the calm of someone who had survived too many storms. She had worked in orphanages and family homes for years and had finally found that stable job that promised a bit of peace. When Elena crossed the mansion's doorway, something inside Valentina tensed. She didn't know why, but that woman made her uncomfortable. It was as if her presence reminded her of something she had spent years trying to forget. Still, she didn't give it much thought. Just another servant, she thought, without imagining that fate had just placed before her the face of her past. The first days were tense. Valentina couldn't stand Elena's slowness, nor her way of looking at things with tenderness, as if every object had a soul. The young millionaire demanded perfection. There could be no dust. The dishes had to shine like mirrors, and the curtains had to fall perfectly straight to the millimeter. And when something wasn't to her liking, her voice became cold and sharp. Elena, silently, endured each humiliation with dignity. She never answered back. But what drew the most attention was the way Elena looked at Valentina when she wasn't watching. That gaze wasn't one of resentment or fear. It was a mixture of tenderness and pain, as if something inside her compelled her to protect her despite everything. There was something in the young woman's movements, in her tone of voice, in the way she arched her eyebrows when angry, that felt painfully familiar. At night, when everyone slept, Elena would wander quietly through the house. She touched the framed portraits in the hallway, the expensive furniture, the imported lamps. She would stop especially before a small photo on the mantel, a baby in the arms of a nurse wrapped in an ivory-colored blanket. Her eyes would fill with tears. It was impossible. And yet, something in her heart told her she shouldn't dismiss that possibility. Meanwhile, Valentina kept living her life surrounded by luxury, believing that love was weakness and that respect was bought through fear. She couldn't understand why the mansion, though full of people, seemed emptier every day. She didn't understand why the serene face of that housemaid disturbed her so deeply. Deep down, there was something in her eyes that stirred something inside her. Something that even all the money in the world could silence. What neither of them knew was that the past was about to return with force. The wounds they thought had healed were about to awaken again. Because in that house, wealth and servitude didn't live alone. Secrets lived there too. Secrets that had been waiting for years to be revealed. In the days that followed, the mansion continued to run like a Swiss clock. Gardeners arriving at dawn, cooks preparing breakfasts worthy of a five-star hotel, drivers waiting for orders, and employees moving about like shadows trained not to make a sound. Only one thing stood out in that perfect environment, the way Valentina treated Elena. Any small mistake became an excuse for the young woman to vent the resentment she had carried since childhood. If the table wasn't perfectly aligned, came the icy glare. If the clothes didn't have the usual scent, came the reprimand. The other staff members noticed that something strange was happening because Elena was experienced, dedicated, and almost never made mistakes. Yet she endured everything in silence, without defending herself, as if she understood that sometimes cruelty doesn't come from hatred, but from emptiness. She saw in Valentina a wound that had never been healed. She could recognize it easily, for she had spent years caring for abandoned children. Children who lashed out so they wouldn't be hurt, who humiliated others to avoid being rejected. And as painful as it was to be the target of that arrogance, Elena had the strange feeling that she was there for a reason greater than just working. When everyone left, she would wander the house's hallways, lost in thought about her past. That small orphanage in Puebla, the worn-out mattresses, the smell of powdered milk, the nighttime, cries of new arrivals. She remembered clearly a pale-skinned girl with sharp eyes and a hunger for affection. A little girl named Valeria, who had been handed over unexpectedly to a wealthy family. That day, Elena had cried in secret because she had grown too attached to the child. Now, so many. Years later, fate placed before her a young woman who had the same way of furrowing her brow, the same shape of chin, the same impatient gaze toward the world. Even with all those memories, Elena didn't dare believe it completely. Life had already shown her that misplaced hope could be cruel. So she preferred to work, to wait, to observe. Meanwhile, Valentina wrestled with her own ghosts. She would never admit it, but the arrival of that maid had shaken her emotional balance. She had grown up hearing that her biological mother had died when she was little, and that it wasn't worth digging into. That past. Don Arturo had always made it clear that the past was closed, and what mattered was who she was now. A Mendez, an heiress, prepared to run businesses and deal with people. That's why the idea of having any connection to a poor place, to abandoned children, or to people without last names, made her uncomfortable. Yet Elena's gaze tore down that wall. Sometimes, when she saw her cleaning the staircase steps or arranging the silverware so delicately, Valentina felt a sting of guilt, as if she were hurting someone who didn't deserve it. But instead of accepting that emotion, she repressed it. She hardened her posture, believing that showing kindness meant showing weakness. One afternoon, while cleaning Don Arturo's office, Elena found an old envelope inside a drawer containing some adoption papers. She didn't touch them, only caught a glimpse of a stamp from an institution in Puebla. Her heart started racing. She almost dropped the cloth in her hand. That night, in her small room behind the mansion, she sat at the edge of her bed and cried softly. It wasn't a cry of sorrow, but of recognition. It felt as if God, time, and destiny had conspired to place her there, in that house, at that moment in her life, precisely when she no longer expected to find anyone from her past. She decided to wait a little longer, because she still had no proof. In the meantime, she would treat Valentina not as a cruel employer, but as the little girl who might once have been torn from her arms. And she began to show it in the smallest details. She made the young woman's room cozier, folded her clothes with more care, placed fresh flowers near her window. Little gestures of a mother who could not reveal her name. On the other side, something began to change in Valentina as, well, though she would never admit it. She started to notice that, unlike the other maids, Elena didn't look at her with fear or flattery. She looked at her with a kind of compassion she didn't understand. And that irritated her, because compassion made her feel small. Some mornings, when coming down for breakfast, she saw Elena preparing the table with care and felt the urge to ask why she behaved that way, even after being humiliated. But she stayed silent. She didn't have the emotional vocabulary for that. Deep down, however, a question began to echo within her. Why does this woman act as if she already knows me? Why does she look sad when I shout? Why does she hold back her tears when my father mentions my adoption? Valentina didn't know it yet, but the past was drawing dangerously close to the present. All it would take was a single piece of paper, an old photograph, or a careless phrase for everything to come to light. And when the truth arrives, it doesn't knock. It enters and changes everything. That night, Elena didn't sleep. Sitting on her bed, she held in her hands a small, rusted medal she always wore around her neck. In the center, a name was engraved in fine, letters, Valeria. It was the only reminder of a time when she had poured her soul into caring for children nobody wanted. In her mind, the walls of the Puebla orphanage came back to life. The smell of watery soup, the corridors filled with laughter and crying, the cribs lined up like little hopes. There, she had lived through the hardest and yet most human years of her life. She clearly remembered a little girl unlike the rest, pale as paper, with deep eyes that seemed to understand the world even before she could speak. She was restless, strong, and often clung to Elena's apron as if she somehow knew the world could take her away at any moment. That little girl's name was Valeria. Elena had cared for her as if she were her own. She had taught her to walk, to laugh, to recognize her voice among all others. But one day, without warning, men in expensive suits arrived. They said the orphanage was to be shut down, that some children would be handed over to good families. Elena tried to protest, but she had no rights. The little girl was taken away in someone's arms, wrapped in a white linen blanket, without even a chance to say goodbye. And that day, Elena's heart broke. Forever. Years later, every time she saw a dark-haired girl with intense eyes, she found herself searching for Valeria's face. But time kept moving, and life, in its irony, led her down humble paths. She worked cleaning houses, cooking, caring for the elderly, until decades later she arrived at the mansion of Don Arturo Mendez, never imagining that fate was closing a circle. Meanwhile, Valentina couldn't shake the strange bond she felt with that maid. One afternoon, while checking the cleaning supplies, she accidentally came across an old photograph among Elena's personal belongings. In the picture, a young woman, clearly Elena in her youth, held a baby wrapped in a white blanket. On the back, it read, Valeria, 2000. Valentina's heart skipped a beat. That name, Valeria. She didn't know why, but it sounded familiar, as if she had heard it in dreams or buried memories from her childhood. That same night, she stood before her bathroom mirror, staring at her own reflection. Who am I really? She thought. Blurred flashes began to surface in her mind. The sound of a distant cry, the scent of cheap soap, a woman's voice singing a melody she had never heard in her home. All of it shook her deeply. It was the first time in years she felt afraid. Not of others, but of herself, of what she didn't know, of what her father had hidden from her. Elena, on the other hand, understood she could no longer stay silent. The truth was too close to keep buried. She knew Don Arturo would never allow his daughter to learn her true origins, but she also knew that silence sooner or later destroys. So she began to leave subtle signs, a passing remark about Puebla, a comment about adoptions, a lullaby softly hummed while cleaning. Each gesture was a thread cast toward the past, hoping Valentina would grasp it. The tension between them became unbearable. The staff noticed. The young woman seemed nervous, distracted, less cruel. And Elena, she looked sadder, but more resolute. She knew the truth was about to rise, and with it the weight of 20 years of secrets. The night Valentina decided to ask about her adoption, she accidentally overheard a conversation between her father and a lawyer in the office. They mentioned papers from an orphanage in Puebla, a silent agreement, a donation in exchange for discretion. Her heart tightened. It was the confirmation she never wanted. As the rain struck the windows, she slowly descended the stairs. She found Elena in the kitchen, polishing the silverware with her worn hands. For the first time, she didn't see a servant. She saw a tired woman, with eyes full of tenderness that disarmed her completely. And then, without speaking a word, she understood that something much greater bound them together. Dawn arrived with an eerie silence at the Mendez mansion. The hallways that always buzzed with the sounds of the staff felt heavy, as if something invisible was about to shatter. Valentina had spent the night awake, staring over and over at the photo she'd found, comparing the baby's face to her own, searching for answers in the expression of the woman holding the child with a mix of pride and sorrow. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that something didn't fit in the story her father had told her all her life. When she came down for breakfast, Elena was already there, serving coffee with her usual calm. But there was a different light in her eyes, a restrained tension, as though she sensed that something in the air had shifted. Valentina watched her in silence, analyzing every gesture, the way she moved her hands, her steady voice, the tenderness with which she cleared the tray. It was like watching someone who had always been part of her story, even if she didn't yet understand how. All day, Valentina couldn't focus. She tried to call her father to confront him, but he was away on a trip to Monterey. The delay tormented her. She needed to understand once and for all why there was so much secrecy surrounding her childhood. Finally, she decided to go to Elena's room, a small space at the back of the house she had never entered before. She pushed the door open, without knocking. Inside, she found a humble but spotless room, a neatly made bed, an open Bible on the nightstand, and a wooden box at its foot. She knelt down and opened it carefully. Inside were old letters, rosaries, a worn-out doll, and a folded copy of an adoption document bearing her own name. Valentina froze. At the bottom of the document, one name stood out, Elena Vargas, listed as the primary caretaker of the child at the Nuestra Señora del Refugio Orphanage. Tears began to fall, though she couldn't tell if they came from anger, grief, or confusion. Suddenly, the foundation, her perfect world collapsed. Her entire life, her last name, her arrogance, her certainty, turned into an empty structure built on lies. That night, Elena found her in the garden, standing under a fine rain, her gaze lost. Without speaking, they looked at each other. There was something powerful in that silent exchange. The truth no longer needed words. Valentina felt in her chest a recognition so deep it hurt, as if her body remembered what her mind had long forgotten. In the days that followed, the young woman began to see everything with new eyes. The mansion's walls, once symbols of power, now looked like golden cages. She looked at Elena with a mix of guilt and tenderness, remembering every harsh word, every insult, and feeling the unbearable weight of shame. Yet within her grew a new curiosity. She wanted to know who this woman had been before becoming her servant. She wanted to understand what had really happened. Elena, for her part, dreaded the moment Don Arturo would return. She knew he would never accept the truth that connected them. But there was no turning back now. She decided to write Valentina a letter, explaining everything. That letter, hidden under the young woman's pillow, would become the final bridge between past and present. In it, Elena told how she had met an abandoned baby at the orphanage, how she had cared for her as if she were her own, how she had watched her being taken away in the arms of a man who promised to give her a better life. She wrote how, after that day, her life had lost meaning, and how she had spent the following years searching for her face in every orphan child that arrived. "I didn't look for you to demand anything," she wrote, "but to make sure you were loved. And when I found you, I realized you weren't just my little girl. You were also my lesson. God taught me that true love never dies. It only waits for the moment to be recognized." When Valentina read those words, her soul broke in silence. She realized she had lived hating the world for not giving her love, when in truth, love had always been there, cleaning her floors, folding her clothes, and enduring her cruelty without complaint. From that day forward, something began to change between them. They no longer acted as mistress and maid, but as two souls tied by an invisible thread. Yet destiny, unpredictable as ever, still held one last test. Because when Don Arturo returned, the truth would come with consequences no one could escape. The sound of a luxury engine shattered the stillness of the evening. Don Arturo had returned. Valentina felt her heart pound in her chest as if it wanted to escape. She had spent days trying to prepare for that moment, but there was no way to soften the inevitable. Elena, on the other hand, knew that this encounter would decide everything. She walked slowly, with the serenity of someone who had already made peace with the truth. She wasn't afraid. She had spent too long in silence. Now it was time to speak. That night, the house was unusually quiet. The servants had gone home early, sensing that something important was about to happen. In the dining room, Don Arturo sat across from his daughter, unaware of the tension in her eyes. He spoke of business, contracts, and investment in Spain. But Valentina wasn't listening. Finally, with a trembling voice, she asked, "Who was my real mother?" He froze. In 20 years, he had never heard that question spoken with such determination. He tried to change the subject, but she pressed on. She pulled from her pocket the adoption document she had found in Elena's room and laid it on the table. The silence was absolute. Don Arturo took a deep breath and removed his glasses. "That belongs to a past you don't need to dig up," he murmured. But Valentina refused to accept evasions. "I need to know who I am," she said, firmly. That was when Elena, who had been listening from the doorway, entered the dining room slowly. In her hands, she held a yellowed envelope. "I can answer that, señorita," she said softly, though her voice carried weight. Don Arturo stood up instantly, startled. "It's not your place to speak," he snapped. But Elena didn't back down. She opened the envelope and took out a photograph, her younger self, holding a baby wrapped in a white blanket. Her name was Valeria. "I cared for her at the Nuestra Señora del Refugio orphanage. You, sir, were the one who adopted her." The words hung in the air like a silent thunderclap. Don Arturo's face went pale. Valentina stood motionless, holding her breath. "I'm that baby," she whispered as tears blurred her vision. Elena nodded. "And I was the one who held you when no one else wanted to. I was the one who taught you to smile." Valentina's world, collapsed in a single instant. Her arrogance, her anger, her contempt, all of it crumbled like a castle of sand. Don Arturo, ashamed, confessed that he had paid to speed up the adoption process, ensuring no contact would be kept with the orphanage. "I wanted to give you everything," he said, "but I didn't know how to give you love." It was the most honest sentence he had spoken in years. Elena stood there, tears glimmering but dignity intact. "I didn't come to judge you, senor," she said softly. "I only wanted to see her, to know she's all right." The silence that followed said more than words ever could. Valentina slowly approached Elena. She looked at her closely, as if memorizing every line of her face, every wrinkle that time had drawn. In that moment, she understood that true luxury wasn't diamonds or mansions. It was the unconditional love she had rejected without knowing it. Elena extended a trembling hand. Valentina took it and held it tightly. There was no reproach, only gratitude and remorse. Don Arturo turned away, unable to face the weight of what he had hidden. Elena knew her time in that house had come to an end. She had fulfilled her purpose. But before leaving, she whispered, "Love doesn't disappear, my child. It just waits for the moment to be recognized." Valentina said nothing. She walked her to the main door, under a gentle rain that seemed to wash the air clean of accumulated sins. When the door closed, the mansion felt different. No longer a symbol of power, but of loss and of a beginning. Elena walked away slowly, tears falling onto the wet ground. She didn't know if they would ever see each other again, but something in her heart told her that this time her little girl would know how to find her. And that thought was enough. Several days passed after that night. The Mendez mansion had become a silent, almost sacred place. Valentina barely spoke. The arrogant gleam in her eyes had vanished, replaced by deep sorrow, but also by something new: humanity. For the first time, she understood the true weight of things. The jewels, the trips, the contracts, all of it faded before the power of one single truth. She had humiliated the only person who had ever truly loved her. She couldn't bear the distance any longer. One morning, without telling anyone, Valentina dressed in simple clothes and left the mansion. She took a taxi to the neighborhood where Elena lived, a humble place, full of narrow streets and hand-painted walls. When she arrived, she saw the woman watering flower pots in front of an old house. Elena looked up, and for an instant, time stood still. Neither of them spoke. It wasn't necessary. Valentina's tears said everything. She walked slowly toward Elena, and when she reached her, she knelt and hugged her tightly, like a child finally finding shelter. That embrace wasn't just a physical act. It was the closing of 20 years of emptiness. Elena held her without saying a word, gently stroking her hair, just as she used to when Valeria was only a baby. The young woman trembled, murmuring between quiet sobs, and Elena repeated silently in her mind a single prayer. Thank you, God, for returning what I thought I had lost. Hours passed as they talked. Valentina wanted to know everything. What her childhood had been like in the orphanage. What songs Elena used to sing to her. What dreams she had for her. Each story was a wound healing. And as she listened, she realized how empty her life of luxury had been and how rich the woman before her truly was. A woman who had owned nothing material, yet had given everything. When Valentina returned to the mansion, she made a decision. On the main wall, where a grand portrait of Don Arturo had once hung, she placed a new photo. Her and Elena, hugging, laughing beneath the sunlight. It wasn't just a symbolic act, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She decided to fund the reconstruction of the Nuestra Señora del Refugio orphanage, the place where everything had begun. She renamed it with a new sign, Hogar Valeria, in honor of the child she once was and the woman who had unknowingly saved her. Elena, now older, became the director of the home. Valentina visited every week, helping care for the children, telling them stories, teaching them that love cannot be bought or demanded. It must be nurtured. Don Arturo, quietly, began to change too. Perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of late-blooming love, he donated part of his fortune to the cause. But in his eyes there was something different. Pride. For the first time, he truly felt like a father. Time passed, but that bond was never broken again. In Valentina's eyes now shone the same peace she had once seen in Elena's. She was no longer the millionaire's daughter. She was the daughter of love. Sometimes destiny takes enormous turns just so the soul can return to its origin. And in that return, though it may hurt, we finally learn who we truly are. If this story touched your heart, write in the comments. Love always returns, even when time tries to hide it. And remember, every act of humility can heal an entire life.